Can you hear me? I'll try it. Can you hear me now? This work?
Okay, but if it works, it works.
Okay. So yeah, as far as my background, I've always been passionate about the energy industry. And it's not just the industry as a whole, as far as like the job opportunities, which is what initially got me started with it, but it's more the efficiency side of things. I love looking at the entire round trip efficiency on everything, whatever it may be, whether it's on your home energy usage or the community or the state of North Dakota as an example, which is what we're talking about today. And this topic we're bringing up is worded as describing the plan from the governor for the carbon neutrality for 2030. So I'm just going to go through some of the data that I've put together personally. And I also want to throw a few side notes down that I'm Commerce Department. I'm not necessarily regulating this plan or this goal, I should say. We are working towards bringing companies to the state interested in innovation, trying to lower our carbon footprint and lower the overall amount of carbon emissions through carbon neutrality. Also, the other departments are working on the same thing. So I threw a couple slides in here that I actually just saw on Monday of this week at a different conference for the Indian Affairs Government to Government Relations Conference here in Bismarck. And there, the head of DEQ had presented some of his ideas related to carbon neutrality and some of their methods of looking at the overall footprint. So I threw some of his slides in for definition because it's kind of ironic how we both kind of came up with this with very similar attitudes towards it, ways to look at it. So first off, this is the overview of my presentation. Going through the goal that was set. Governor Burgum set this goal of being carbon neutral by 2030, and he has been emphasizing the point of doing it through innovation versus regulation. So he's looking for new ideas, new tech, new companies coming to the state. So not only will it help bring us to carbon neutrality, but it also increases the business within the state. And I will start off by looking also at the carbon output. And that's where I just want to throw this out there. Like we talked about 45 minutes or so for a presentation, and afterwards are questions. Once we start getting into that, I know, well, for myself as well, the questions could just keep on going. Like we could keep digging and digging into the whys and the reasoning on how you calculate everything. I just want to throw this out there that these are calculations that it's more of a, I'm trying to explain our reasoning on these calculations, this definition. It doesn't necessarily mean they are the final absolute numbers, because there's a lot of ways to look at these issues. And then talk about how do you reach neutrality? Now you've got a couple options. You've got lowering your actual emissions. You've got sequestration. You've got consumption of CO2 is the other one. So definitions. This actually goes to what Dave Block had given out in his. He talked about the definition of carbon neutral versus carbon neutrality. So being carbon neutral would be having no net release of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, versus carbon neutrality is a state of net zero, meaning once you look at everything, you may be emitting carbon up front, but you're doing some other activity to capture, to consume that carbon on the background, whether you're offsetting another business, a product, or just increasing or I should say lowering the carbon footprint overall of the process to make it a net carbon process. So these are my definitions, the way I listed this. I looked at it in two different ways. We could go about reaching carbon neutrality through total carbon output due to human activity is compensated through storage or sequestration or consumption. And so in that case, we'd be looking at our entire output of carbon dioxide, and we'd somehow have to offset that, whether we're capturing it, storing it, consuming it with more plant growth, whatever it may be. Or the other option would be to do literally nothing, stop making energy, stop making products. Basically, if we stop emitting carbon, then I guess we would technically be carbon neutral, even though not really, because we're humans. So therefore, every one of us emits a fair amount of carbon dioxide through respiration, and that's virtually impossible. But I'm just kind of throwing those two options out there because they are two different thought processes. Some people kind of push towards carbon neutrality through shutting down anything that's emitting carbon, versus the other option of how about we come up with ways to consume carbon in other ways or store it. So based on the plan of being carbon neutral through innovation versus regulation, this presentation is pushing towards this option one. We're still going to have carbon emissions. We need to come up with ways to offset that carbon that we're emitting. So some of the footprint considerations, and this is where, again, I want to throw this out there as far as my role at Commerce as the Energy Research and Business Development Manager. I dug into this deeply. I'm passionate about this. I'm interested in it, and I want to know how we're going to tally everything. We don't have a hard set rule on this. For the most part, what all state governments look for is the EIA data, what you see online, what you see. They look at all the oil and gas, coal, and then products as well. So there's a number, you can go look it up online to see the emissions of transportation in the state of North Dakota versus the country, the emissions per capita. You can look at all that. This data that I'm presenting today is that information from the EIA websites combined with what we know within our state, all of our production, whether it's oil, gas, electricity, and then I'm looking at the actual boundaries. And that's where we don't, not everyone sees eye to eye. And I'll give the example, these two bullets here. Electric generation within the state of North Dakota. I used to work at Coal Creek Station. Coal Creek would make 1,200 megawatts consistent load of electricity throughout the year. 1,200 megawatts at the time of it being built was more than the state of North Dakota would consume, even if it was only on that one power plant. To this day, all that power is sent to Minnesota. So Minnesota consumers are purchasing that power and using that power. It goes out on the MISO grid. It's not consumed within the state of North Dakota. Now, it could be, you can reroute it. There's ways to do that. But if you look at carbon footprints, are we going to count the emissions within our state boundary for a product that is utilized out of state? And that's the big question, because we are an energy exporting state. 50% of our electricity, more than that number, leaves the state. And if we wanted to lower that carbon footprint by 50%, we could simply just say, okay, we'll just supply the power. We couldn't do that. The grid would not allow it, but hypothetically, that would do it. But there's consumers out there that need that power, going from Minneapolis clear to the Canadian border for that one power plant alone. They're serving over 1 million customers, more than the state of North Dakota. So that's one way of looking at it. We got to calculate, well, how much of our carbon we utilize within our border is in fact due to our population. Do we want to count all of it, or do we want to only count what we use? And an even bigger one is the natural gas and oil. Natural gas, it's 85+% of our natural gas is utilized out of the state of North Dakota. So that number is growing because we continue to grow. The natural gas continues to increase in production constantly. And the demand, as we know, because of the pricing right now, demand of it's going up as well. So it's, do we count that carbon? Do we not count that carbon? Those are things I don't really have an answer for, but I want to bring it up as a conversation because it's worth thinking about, it's worth talking about. So we need to understand the boundary, and that's the one thing I want to lay out there. And then I highlighted this point here saying, at this point, the numbers don't have to be correct. Like, it doesn't have to be exact, because we want the philosophy behind it, how we're calculating it, figured out. Like whether or not we know the exact megawatts consumed within the state or the exact tons of CO2 per each location, that's not what I'm looking at. I'm more so looking at the entire philosophy as far as knowing how much carbon we are consuming or we are emitting as a state population. All right, then the other thing I want to throw out there too is just the idea of carbon. Like we all talk about carbon, we say CO2 or we say carbon. Very, not all the time do we say carbon dioxide, but the carbon we're pulling out of the ground is coming in the form of oil, natural gas, or coal, and that carbon comes as carbon, doesn't come with the oxygen. So when we talk about the actual tons, and that's something that's hard to wrap your head around. You look at the molecular weight of carbon versus CO2, it is a lot of the majority of the weight is coming from the oxygen pulled out of the air. I just throw that out there because when we're talking those pounds of carbon coming out of the ground versus pounds of carbon going into the air, it's multiplied by 3.67 because that's just the mass balance of the molecule. Something I think needs to be considered when we talk about tons going into the atmosphere. So much of those tons were in the atmosphere in oxygen form prior. All right, then carbon out in sequestered, consumed. We got to look at how that carbon ends up in the atmosphere. Like what the number you gave, Sharon, at the beginning, the 51 billion
Yes.
tons. So that number, I don't know where you got it, and I'm not.
Bill Gates.
Okay, so very frequently they measure those in equivalents. So that means methane, I think they now say it's 27 times that of carbon dioxide. So then if they do a carbon equivalent calculation, that 1 ton of methane could be considered 27 tons equivalent CO2, which can then be thrown into that additional, that number. And this presentation I'm presenting here does not do that. Like I don't have the methane, I don't have the NOx, I don't have the other carbon equivalents escalated up. I'm only looking at carbon, just throwing that out there. And then the other options of, or the other emissions of carbon dioxide would be the direct energy sources, biological, like I said, humans. There's a fairly substantial amount of tons that comes out in the state of North Dakota just from our state population of 780,000 people. Livestock, agriculture. Agriculture is a big one. You've got fertilizer. You've got, there's fuel consumed, but really, you look into fertilizers and such. That's another one to tally up as well. So there's quite a bit to consider. Second bullet here also, imported materials. That one is really critical. And I think we should keep an eye on that one because that's where we can actually make a difference. If there's something we're importing from across the world that's high carbon footprint that we could do right here within our state border, that offsets that carbon. So
I'm gonna just try some real quick. Start my video and just see if it can put you in the corner while you have PowerPoint.
sure. I got a light on my camera.
Nope, that isn't gonna work. Just unshare your video. I guess all right.
I'm screen
Saying
sharing.
it does work. Okay.
It does work.
Yep.
Okay,
All right.
we're good?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, the materials thing too, I just want to throw that out there as a sidebar too. You look at plastics, you look at anything that takes a lot of processing. If we're bringing that into our state, but lumber is another example. People look at that very differently. Some consider that a carbon storage method, really, because it's carbon that stays in the carbon format. But all of those things can be looked at really heavily. And I'll just be straightforward. I don't have the data for that, but I think it should be thrown into the calculation because if we come up with a way, for example, plastics, of making plastics locally here within the state that are biodegradable, made in a green format, will be able to be turned right back into the carbon in the soil versus stay plastic for decades. That could be a major advantage And we should look at that as an option. And we are actually, we've got active projects right now coming to North Dakota that want to do those projects. So those are things we're considering. Carbon in. These are the obvious ones, I guess. You got vegetation. You look at farmland. You look at CRP in the state, which is the number's been going down. You look at forests. All of those things will consume carbon. Just depends on which part of the country you're in as far as how much they consume, but that's a significant amount of carbon that gets consumed. And then sequestration, and that's probably based on the discussion we had or the intro. It's probably a pretty hot item. Well, I know it's a hot item within the state because we're looking at carbon sequestration. So storage via well injection, and the other one would be enhanced oil recovery. So those are major projects going on, not just in the energy production like for the coal plants, but they're going on with ethanol as well in the state. These slides I stole from Dave Blott earlier this week. I asked for them just because I had not seen these before, but this is interesting, just a little take on the United States as far as the different sectors and our emissions and what we've done in the last 30 years. And here you can see that there is reduction just based on our efficiency changes through vehicles, through infrastructure, and obviously our electricity and the way we produce it as well. So overall reduction, but probably more interestingly is the state of North Dakota. These are our emissions, and here's our change, just to give you an idea. And this is what I think the hot ticket item is for everybody, because if you look at our gas and oil, you look at our exporting of electricity. I mean, when it comes down to it, it's not we're using more energy, it's because we're producing more energy to sell to the market. So this is the moving target we have to work with as far as total emissions in the state of North Dakota. All right, getting into the data now. This is where I know lots of conversations will come up. I put this data together based on EIA. So this, like, again, from the very first opening slide, I'm not claiming this is correct because there's so many considerations. And I'm looking at each sector and I'm looking at what we pull out, what we produce, what comes out of the state of North Dakota. So this pie graph shows that number based on production of the three methods of getting carbon out. You got natural gas, you got coal, and you got oil. And so some people would look at that and your first thought is, well, what about propane? What about gasoline? What about diesel fuel? What about all these other methods of creating carbon dioxide? But if you really simplify it, where's the carbon coming from all of those sources? It's all coming from these three right here. You're pulling carbon out from coal, you're pulling carbon out from oil, and you're pulling it out from natural gas. And that's the data that you can easily collect. Anyone in the public can go look at it on EIA. So these are the numbers right here of carbon dioxide. And by the way, this is not emitted in the state. I really want to throw that out there. This is total number because I'm taking the number of decatherms, the number of barrels, and the number of tons of coal, and I'm using an average carbon content and using 100% of that carbon going up as carbon dioxide, multiplying it out times that ratio. This is how much we technically, if we took every single thing we did in 1 year in 2020 and burned it and created all of it, this is what we could get out of it. It's over 300 million tons of carbon dioxide. So substantial number. Now, does that count to North Dakota? Or does that count to the consumer or the user? You know what I'm getting at? This is just the data. I'm just showing you what's off of EIA. Moving forward now, we look at sources by source consumed within the state of North Dakota. There's going to be more slices of the pie, I guarantee it, because they don't have all the data for how much rubber and soles of shoes we import into the state of North Dakota, because we do, obviously, and there's a carbon footprint to that. However, this is just kind of like roughing it out, looking at natural gas consumption, coal consumption, and then the consumption of those other goods that were made off of oil. Like some of it wasn't even produced in the state of North Dakota, it was imported. Some of these transportation, well, most of it, transportation fuels. However, that's what we consumed based on EIA data. So this tallies it up to show how many tons of CO2 did we actually use as a population of 780,000. And based on this number, 48 million tons. So 309 million tons, 48. Now, the rest of those are, well, actually, they are not all emitted in carbon dioxide, because if you look at the oil portion of it, oil is going into products. You know, lots of that carbon is staying in that plastic form, that probably stays in plastic form for many, many years. It doesn't all go up as CO2, but it is a substantial difference when you look at production numbers versus consumption numbers, is the purpose of that slide. So, what else here? Oh yeah, the first bullet here, oil. You've got fuels, material, and the other one is fertilizer I put in here too, just for something to think about. It's a small number based on what I found. I'm not going to say that's true or completely accurate, because I couldn't find all the data. You know, like this is stuff that could take more research. You could look into it, find more, but that some of these products, fertilizer, I'm just throwing that out there as an example, because there's potential projects coming to the state. These are things that we could really lower our carbon footprint, because if you don't have to import it, and instead you could produce it here in a more efficient way with less of a carbon emission, then that's a reduction that offsets that carbon that we're otherwise having to import to the state. This is a ratio of those last two slides. You've got overall in-state versus out of state. And this I like to show as a really good visual, especially for anyone that really wants to like put the nails to us, because we are an energy intensive state. Like, and that's very common that we get hit hard, because like our car, like you look at how much coal we consume and whatnot. Well, here's the ratio. This is what we send out versus what we use in state. It's a pretty substantial. We are absolutely an exporter of our energy. We do not consume everything we're pulling out of the ground. And there's I've got pretty good proof there's a demand for it based on my bill I had at the gas station on the way here today. It's obviously used right now pretty heavily, this energy that we're exporting out of the state. These last two bullets here just talk about the number of products that we bring in are not all into this calculation. And I think all of us can vouch for the fact, or can understand that the amount of products you go to the store and you buy and you bring into your home that we do not produce here. They're not produced in the United States for that matter. They're shipped from across the ocean. So all of those things should be considered when we talk about carbon. That's one of my, that's one of my passions right now, is if you talk about carbon footprint, we can't just look at only what's going on in our backyard. We have to look at the entire process. Just think about that when it comes to all of these projects that we have going forward. Anything that we import has a carbon footprint, and the United States imports most of its goods. All right, now going into consumption sequestration, and this is where talking about the governor's goal of carbon neutrality by 2030. These are so far what we have on the list. And I'm throwing this out there because it's not this, when Sharon, when you talked about the plan, you know, what's the governor's plan? I will say the governor set a goal and he's leaving it to industry and to us as a population to create the plan. It's evolving all the time. So therefore, this is what we have on the list so far. We've got sequestration, which is probably the biggest one when you talk about actual tons. And then we're looking at ways to offset it through farming practices, agriculture, natural consumption, and efficiencies. So this is just the consumption sequestration portion. This pie graph goes into each one of these line items that these are existing projects on the books right now. Right, there's one ethanol plant that just started sequestering their CO2, but they're all looking at it. If you look at the Summit pipeline, that's not just the North Dakota ethanol plants. That's multiple out-of-state ethanol plants looking at a place to send their CO2. And also, just so you know, with ethanol, their CO2 comes out very pure, which is why those are the first ones to go for it. It's definitely the easiest to get to because it's coming out at 99% plus CO2 in their process. So here we've got these different projects going on, and Dakota Gasification, for example, they have been capturing their CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. I should know it off the top of my head, but I can't remember. It's been several years they've been doing that at DGC. But now there's also the project that's made public of DGC being converted to a hydrogen facility, which is on the list right now too. So that's not really into this at all necessarily. This is the number that they've been doing already. And then looking at, I threw in like grassland, forest land. That's an interesting one because if you look at the percentage we have, which really is North Dakota, because of our landscape, it's primarily agriculture. So we don't have a whole lot dedicated to it, but what we do have does amount to a fair amount of CO2 consumption. Project Tundra, this one is been going on for quite some time. They're working on the capture portion of it mainly, because I think the sequestering portion will be ready to go. And Rainbow Energy Center, Coal Creek Station, which is the largest coal plant, is also looking at that. So this is what's on the list as of right now for sequestration. And I'm sure there will be more, but this is only the energy emitters. We don't have really anything left, anything in the calculation on this for the new projects that will come out that could be also a reduction in carbon due to whatever they're producing, having a smaller carbon footprint than the existing technology. So there's more going on than just what you see here, but these are the top public ones that you may see in the news lately. So looking at that, I just kind of took these tons. This is annual tons, by the way. So looking at those tons per year, and then where we're at with respect to the, I think it's 48 million tons, you end up with consumption being at 65%. So these projects all, as far as 2030, looking forward, I can't really predict when these projects will officially be underway and going, but that's on the list as of right now. The other thing I don't have in this slide or in this presentation, but transportation here. I just have a little note, but transportation with EV vehicles is also on the list with the Department of Transportation. They're looking at increasing, well, we already have increased the amount of EV charging stations considerably in the last few years, and they're continuing to grow that. The number of EVs will increase just by consumer demand. And so with that, you'll have an increase in, or I should say a decrease in emissions of those fuel sources, but then you'll have an increase in electricity consumption. So then electricity consumption will go up. Therefore, you're still going to have, doesn't matter, energy is energy, you're still going to use it. So, but that is something that's underway as well. Farming practice is a big one. And that's one that I will not pretend to be an expert on, but from my research I've done, there's definitely a lot of potential carbon consumption increase due to different methods of farming, whether it's fertilization, no-till farming. We're always getting more and more precise in our agriculture because of our automated systems, like between the UAS, the information that we are able to take on the soil and do variable fertilization can help dramatically. So that's one area. And renewable energy as well. There's no secret that North Dakota's increased its wind energy drastically. I think it was at 35% of the megawatt hours in 2021 were from a wind turbine. And that number has gone up. It continued to go up with the tax credits and such as well. So that number continues to go up. But I do also want to throw out there, again, round trip, look at the entire picture. I know like everyone's got their own views and their own way of looking at, like, I've seen it 100 times. Wind turbine, well, that energy's free versus this energy costs money because it consumes fossil fuels. Well, a wind turbine takes energy to build it. We'll just say that. Every single ton that goes into that base, every piece of steel, all the fiberglass, there's a carbon footprint to it. And that's where I think we need to look back, look on the earlier slides of this presentation. We need to look at our production or our products that we're utilizing. And that has to be tallied up as well. Because if it's energy intensive to produce that material that you're utilizing, especially if it's single use, like a good one is batteries. Like what is the energy footprint of a EV? When you look at that electric vehicle, and then you take every little part that goes into building that electric vehicle. Where did it come from? Where did the lithium get mined out of the ground? We have to look at that because that EV has a footprint before it even started, just like a passenger vehicle, fossil fuel vehicle. So those are other considerations to think about as well. All right, this is a visual I just find it really interesting. You could look into it closely. It can create a debate, I know, but it's a good thing to consider. Carbon dioxide, and keep in mind, the number doesn't even matter, it's all the ratio, but this is like, if we took all of the carbon that I said earlier, if we burned every bit of it, turn it all into carbon dioxide, okay? This is the tons that we took out of the ground between the big three carbon sources. This is the oxygen. And then the other side is the carbon dioxide. I just find that really interesting to think about because we always talk about carbon dioxide tons. And it's also something to consider when you look at sequestration, because that's a significant amount of tons. So I just threw that out there as a visual I find kind of interesting. With that, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of good discussion conversations here, but I just wanted to really emphasize this was the goal for 2030, and the goal is set forth trying to lower carbon emissions, trying to find ways to deal with our carbon issues in the state of North Dakota. And by setting that goal, we want innovation to be triggered. And I can tell you from my limited amount of time at Commerce that the amount of interest in our state to come here and try to make lower carbon products, utilize energy resources right there at the site versus transporting out has increased drastically. We are to the point right now, I think Commerce just surpassed $40 billion in potential capital expenditure going towards these projects in the state of North Dakota. And for a population of below 800,000 people, that's a pretty substantial amount of investment. So it's definitely, there's a lot of interest, we'll just say that. So I appreciate your time. And if you guys would like to ask questions or start discussions, I'm definitely interested in any questions.
I'll collect any questions, although people can feel free to
Is it number one?
verbalize their own questions. Anybody take up? You'll do your own.
All right. No. Just trying to see what I can get here. Big margin. Now. Yep. What is the problem? Maybe if I do. Well, I'm gonna myself again.
Like this, does that work? Yes. All right, I think we got it.
All right, try asking some.
Okay. Still.
Now it's better.
I think so. Yep.
All right.
All right. Okay, so how are we promoting innovation through various sectors? It's through commerce, especially. If anybody has a project, if anybody has an idea, and they would like to see that idea put forth, especially if it's getting close to, well, it can be an R&D phase as well, but we have the clean and sustainable energy program. We have the renewable energy program. And we have a lot of incentives, financial incentives for companies that have something innovative to bring to the state. So if they have a good idea that they want to pitch, they can call us up at the Commerce Department, along with your local economic developers as well. And that idea can go all the way up to where you can put in for the grant money, whether it's through LIFT, finance through the Bank of North Dakota, or through these big programs like the Clean and Sustainable Energy Program. And those cover, well, for I deal mostly in energy, but even if it's a manufacturing process that utilizes a lot of energy, those are still open to those programs. So we have a lot of programs for that.
Okay, I've got a question from online here. How much stranded energy from renewable energy resources is unused? And if you want to repeat that question.
Sure. The question is how much stranded energy from renewable sources is unused. I do not have a number for that. Depending on the location in the state, there are some wind farms that are restricted due to transmission line. Not when the demand's low necessarily. It's when there's, well, today, for example, when you have a lot of wind on the grid and you don't necessarily have an extreme hot or cold day, then your demand overall on the grid is low, but your wind energy surpasses that threshold. And keep in mind, that's why there is a limit on that renewable intermittent energy, because we don't have a storage. If you can't store it, building more when it's not needed is, you got to use it. Like, that's the thing about electricity. Electrons go on the grid. Your outlet doesn't care if it's a black or a green electron. Yes.
You just said we needed energy storage, so why aren't we investing in energy storage?
There are energy storage projects out there. There's geothermal, there's compressed gas, there is batteries. We've got actually, well, they're not public, but there's multiple battery producers looking at the state to come here for battery production as well, which batteries is the #1 storage mechanism out there.
But it's not part of it.
Okay, so batteries would not reduce carbon unless,
What if it allowed you to use more? Solar.
yes. That's why I'm saying, like, keep in mind, this was just my list of projects that are out there. Renewables is on there. Adding renewables is on there, but to get to that point,
Sequestration, your pie chart,
mhm,
percentages, over half of that is from coal plants using carbon capture. And, if you would look at the website, the EIA website, which is the one that you're citing, if you look at the levelized cost of electricity, solar and wind are among the cheapest sources of electricity. Plus, they have the lowest carbon output. So why are we not looking at those options?
solar and wind are cheap with tax credits. Because you got to look at the entire
No,
process.
even without the tax credits, if you go to the EIA website, they're still the cheapest.
Okay. And that's where you need to have more energy storage to make that happen.
Right, so why aren't we investing in storage?
Well, I'm just throwing this out there. Tesla has the Powerwall and has had it out there on their website for many years. It's available. If it is cheaper, I would have it. I have a ground source heat pumped home. I'm just saying, like, they can say that's cheaper on their website, but you got to look at the consumer demand. Like, if something's cheaper and it works, consumers buy it.
Yeah, just make a comment there supporting Tanya.
Sure.
Because, you have to look at United States of America as being your customers. All the people who live there, right? So number one would be to interconnect them. So that when you have excess wind power, you can inject it to the HVDC grid and push it to all the other places where they need it, where the wind doesn't blow, right?
Mhm.
So that's objective number one, is interconnection. Then your argument about wind and solar falls flat on its face, because you would have off takers. You would have off takers. And the second thing I want to say is that if you do not look at the overall picture of global warming, increasing temperature, and sequestration, not just sequestration, but avoidance of the CO2 output, it makes no sense to continue using carbon-based fuels when we are looking at adaptation costs that are going to be astronomical. You have to do the mitigation now to avoid the adaptation costs. And you're not taking that into the picture. You're looking at, basically letting us be beholden to carbon-based fuels, instead of moving away from them and create your own independence on this. Because as a reality, we are not the ones controlling the carbon prices in this world. Those are very large corporations that are sort of outside our national boundaries. And you're beholden to them and enslaved to them. by continuing down the road of carbon dependence. So why don't you just think a little bit more about, energy storage, interconnection, utilizing wind and solar better,
Sure.
and trying to eliminate the barriers for distributing the energy.
I'm just, the reason I bring up the economics behind it, EIA says it's cheaper, right? If something's cheaper on the large scale, it's cheaper on the small scale too. And I just throw this out, I like to bring it home, bring it to what we know personally. You're building a house. Are you putting solar on it? Are you putting a wind farm in the backyard? Are you putting batteries in the basement? Like, you got to do the economics behind it. And as an energy nerd, I can tell you I've done it and it still doesn't quite pencil out depending on your energy prices. And we have reasonable energy prices here. If you get up to 25 cents a kilowatt hour, it's different. Sure.
I mean, buy the Tesla Powerwall, it was heavily subsidized.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, that's what you're looking at. Like, if you go back to your slide with Project Tundra.
Yeah.
And the other ones that you have on there, Project Tundra is going to cost $1.5 billion. That's their estimate now.
Yeah.
To build.
And that's a federal tax credit.
And so we're all paying for that, right?
That part, as a state government employee, I don't want to get that. That's a federal tax credit, 50 bucks a ton. Honestly,
But
that's where my slide shows the ratio. You're paying $50 a ton, and 2.6 out of the 3.6 comes from the oxygen. That's what I was. Yeah.
you can't do these projects without the 45Q tax.
And that's our money. That's money that we're making. So when we pay our money in taxes, to subsidize these 45Q tax credits. If we didn't do that, maybe we would have the money to buy a Tesla Powerwall.
Sure.
If we have no choice in the matter.
The EVs and the battery storage and the solar, and there are subsidies for those as well,
But not as
federally,
generous as this.
just
I mean,
not
that's
state.
peanuts compared to what's going on in and also,
Yeah.
whatever the state is. I mean,
But I can just tell you right now, section 45P, that's federal. So
Yes, what is
State
it?
still kicked in R&D
What
money.
50 million.
yes, because it's bringing in, it brings in money to the state.
Brings in money for a state for a project which might or might not work.
Okay, I can't comment further on that one. That's what the federal government chose.
Question on a slightly different topic. I think the governor's definition of neutral is really ingenious. Saying that North Dakota produces 309 million tons of CO2. 15% of the CO2 we produce is used within the state. 85% is exported. So neutral means that we're going to capture the 50% that we use within the state. Doesn't that make North Dakota the nation's pariah? The U.S. Constitution prohibits other states from blocking North Dakota exports. Minnesota sued. Actually, Minnesota tried to put a carbon tax on North Dakota and was sued by North Dakota saying you cannot interfere with interstate commerce. So other states have no choice. They have to take our product with the 85% of CO2 that we're producing assigned to them. They cannot block our exports through the Constitution. They cannot affect our state policies because we're a sovereign state. Isn't our policy basically to make us the nation's pariah then? They're producing CO2 and the other states can't do a damn thing about it.
No, the other states can. Matter of fact, look at Coal Creek Station. They looked at closing that plant, so they wouldn't have that power.
That CO2 goes to us. That's the 15% that we produce. We can count against the
That's
state.
okay. First off, that's my showing of what percentages are consumed in state versus exported, just to really stress that we are an exporting energy state. However, the actual number that they're going to use for our carbon, I can't even say if that's, I don't have that number. But we're looking at where's our boundary? What are we looking at calculating as actual North Dakota emissions? Now, do you count the emissions for the carbon burned for electricity supplied to the state of Minnesota? Do we count those? And if we do, we could reduce those, but then you'd have to shut the power off to that portion of Minnesota, right? Because then they wouldn't have that power.
So going back to the definition of neutral, doesn't neutral mean that we're capturing CO2 that we use within the state?
neutrality be capturing or consuming? So meaning like we're somehow offsetting it, whether it's through vegetation or through capture.
We only consume 15% of the CO2 we produce. 85% goes to exports.
Well, most of it's actually physically exported. It's the CO2 has never existed here. We just had carbon. I mean, if you grow some grain in your farm and sell it to somebody in Minnesota, that's a carbon, right? So now you exported your carbon. If they create carbon dioxide with it, is that your emission? And these are the questions you'd have to consider. I don't know. I don't have an answer for it. But we're not exporting carbon dioxide in that pipeline. We're exporting natural gas, oil. That's not carbon dioxide.
Another person asked a question, how many tons of earth have to be moved to find the rare earth metals for one car battery?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't have an answer for that. It depends on which source you have, because rare earth, like lithium, for example, exists in parts of Western North Dakota in different components, whether it's water, underground, earth, coal, and it's 10 to 70 parts per million. So it depends on which area you're in. I would not have a direct answer for that.
Question over there.
What is the percentage of CO2 in the atmosphere presently? And what would be the ideal amount? And what was it 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 100 years ago, 2,000 years ago? Is there any information on that?
It's all online, and off the top of my head, it's 400. I don't know, is anybody 422, and it was 380 100 years ago. Is that something?
No, less than 350.
Less than 350.
Scientists say 350 is the magic number to try to reduce.
The problem is when you export oil, you're just passing the buck. That's all you do. And that's not responsible. If you claim that it is not responsible to do that. When we have a global problem, it's not just emissions from North Dakota. It's when you pass out the products and then causes the CO2, you're passing the buck to those who have less ability to manage it. It's just like when we export garbage to Africa. It's the same problem. They can't deal with it, but we're selling our junk down there.
I've got a question on the online chat. If North Dakota provides a social benefit by exporting 85% of its energy production to Midwestern states that need the energy, why are they burdened with the CO2 usage if they solve a consumer need? Would it not be more accurate to base CO2 usage by consumer and not by producer?
Okay, so that's getting back to why my opinion is it's not 309, it's the 48 number. You got to base it off the consumer. If somebody wants to buy that energy or buy that source, buy that product, if you want to buy that wind turbine, for example, that the carbon footprint to the material that went into it is yours. You bought the wind turbine. And so that's why it would make sense to use the consumer's number versus the production. Yeah.
Tom, another different thought here. Has the governor addressed the issue of legacy carbon? The carbon that, the 422 parts per million that we added to the atmosphere, how to reduce that? Even if we implement everything on your list there, those parts per million will continue to go up.
I cannot answer for that as from the governor's
Have you
perspective.
discussed that at all? Is that being heard, or-
I discuss it all the time. The fact that Japan had over 20 coal-fired units under construction since their last nuclear issue, like there's a good example. That's not a third world country, and they're looking at ways to make electricity. Usually, people pick whatever's most economical for their area. You're not going to pick the more expensive version. For some reason, some of these other countries are actually putting in more coal-fired power plants, which
The United States has added more to the total than any other country by far.
Mhm.
The legacy carbon that's already exists.
Yep.
We're
China.
responsible for a big share.
Yep.
Per capita.
Per capita, and just from the fact that we are a very developed nation. We've had electricity on the grid for many, many years. And now that's where the ethical question comes in. Like my grandparents got to put electricity in their farmhouse back in the 40s, the 50s, whenever it was. Now you go to these third world nations that have not had electricity. And who are we to tell them that they can't? I mean, this is getting outside of the states, that we're just having a discussion here, but those are those ethical questions. Like, if they're doing it on their own and they want to do that, can we tell them no? What? I don't know. Sure.
Speaking of out of the state, what would happen to North Dakota if we were not exporting coal, oil, electricity, wheat, cattle, on and on? What would happen to North Dakota then?
Our budget would be crushed. Absolutely crushed.
Okay. Point well taken.
And that's one of the most important things to consider. These subsidies that are going out the money for that is coming from our tax base. The tax base that it's coming from
You won't have a tax.
is
base.
oil. Yeah, correct. Yes.
According to the National Renewable Energy Lab, North Dakota has enough wind energy to provide 25% of the entire US electricity consumption. At 10 cents a kilowatt hour, that would triple the state's GDP. More than all the revenue brought in by coal, oil, agriculture would be more than double that just with wind. Why isn't wind energy a cornerstone of the governor's plan?
Wind energy in the state of North Dakota, we rank 6th in the country, I believe.
We do a lot more of that.
And we are, well, this is where I wanted to show you this here. This is hard to do from two screens. Keep in mind, we're kind of getting off the state plan. This is just like a discussion, just trying to talk carbon here. This is public. This is like MISO is what I've worked in the most. So MISO is the market, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. This is a great source to look at. It's windy outside. The green is wind. There's our load right there. That's megawatts. State of North Dakota is pretty small. We're a little tiny spot, right? This is going from the Montana border to Michigan down to the Gulf of Mexico. When you ask the question why we're not interconnected, we are 100%. We are absolutely interconnected. An electron produced here can go anywhere. But this number right here cannot go to 100%. And the reason it can't is because it defies physics. If you want to have the wind blow and then have these two right here, these are the two main, fire back on as soon as the wind stops, it doesn't happen. You can ask the state of Texas after February 2 years ago.
It's kind of question.
California is using natural gas and importing lots of electricity.
The governor's plan, wind is a huge resource that can triple the state's GDP. Why not the governor how we need to develop this resource that's clean, carbon-free, and can do wonders for the state and the country? Why are we hearing about that?
Wind has grown more than any other electricity generator in the state of North Dakota.
In your presentation, it's not the governor's plan. Why not?
It doesn't, it's not reducing carbon.
It's offsetting carbon, it's offsetting coal, which.
When you put a wind turbine up, you know how much time it takes for it to produce the energy it took to build it?
It takes 3 years to pay for itself.
3 years to produce its energy.
But they've designed for 25 to 30 years.
They're repowered every 10 to 15. And that's not free.
They're repowered
So-
because you get better blade,
I-
better aerodynamics, but this turbine is designed to last 25 to 30 years, as is. Now, as time goes by, you will find technological development that justifies the repower.
These wind turbines started 25 years ago. with subsidies.
Yeah, but what
These have been
started
subsidized heavy. That's probably the heaviest subsidy. Section 45 is throwing a loop in it, of course. That's a pretty big subsidy, but wind turbines have had $20 plus per megawatt hour for 10 years minimum on every turbine gone up. Big dollars. Yep.
With the 45 tax credits, that's gonna be 10 times that subsidy.
I couldn't verify that, but yes. That's if we do all that, if all of the carbon is captured. I mean, you look at, this is every wind turbine here, you're talking, that's a lot of megawatt hours, a lot of megawatt hours.
Well, North Dakota does have wind turbines. How come the NRAL, we can just want the entire state of electricity for wind turbines? Why is that not a major initiative? Why isn't the governor bragging about this? That's something that other states would love. It's something that we can bring right into the state. That's a resource we're not utilizing.
Well, as far as the wind issue, I can tell you from working in the industry, transmission lines are expensive. Managing this peak, off peak is also very, very intensive. There's a lot going on in the background to keep all of our lights on. Like, it's not, you don't just flip a switch and it all works out just fine. If this number gets too big and the wind stops blowing, we do not have the technology.
It really does.
Honestly, if you have it, that's why innovation, right? Bring it to the table. We have multiple battery companies working on it. We have incentives for those. And we are absolutely wide open. Trust me, as an energy developer, if you have a really good idea and a project that looks like it could come to fruition, we will absolutely work with you on it.
Question, go ahead, Paul, and then James, and then Larry.
Yeah.
'Cause I know Larry's been
What's
waiting.
the problem with solar and wind? Lithium to make batteries. You can't hardly get it anymore. They're trying to mine it readily, but it's hard to find for one thing.
That's a very good point. And that's actually from the round trip. That's what I was getting at with, maybe we should start producing that here. If there's a way to extract lithium, we should consider that. If you go online, go look at aerial views of lithium mines. There's a reason they're not here. A very good reason. It doesn't look anything like our surface coal mines that 10 years later are being utilized for farmland. It's a very different process.
Yeah, and we outlawed slavery a while back too.
It's all of our lithium is coming from out of our borders right now. And matter of fact, the federal government is putting funding into trying to get battery production within the United States.
A lot of the
Mhm.
infrastructure money that went to the US Geological Survey is going right into that.
Yep.
Into finding lithium sources.
And we do have active projects in North Dakota with utilizing that program. And believe me, that no one's holding them back. We want them here, absolutely.
We talked a little bit about solar, but North Dakota is we have almost zero solar in North Dakota. And it's because we don't have anything mirroring a net metering law. Minnesota's, I know some guys that put solar in over there, they're just going gangbusters. Rooftop solar, community solar projects all over the place. Cities are putting them up. And North Dakota, I didn't see on the governor's plan there, a plan to increase solar production. And by doing this, instituting working on a net metering bill.
That's a
Has
good
he
question.
done it?
I haven't gotten into that one yet. I have worked with a local solar company that is working. They've done some solar projects here in here in North Dakota. And matter of fact, I think they're growing pretty quickly. But as far as net metering, part of that, you have to mandate the buyback to where even if there's not a demand for that energy, you got to buy it back.
Yeah, all the other states that have it are doing that.
Yeah.
Been doing it for
Yeah.
10 years as working fine.
And then, well, because you can end up with an issue where you end up throttling everything else down. And then you have to make up for it as soon as the clouds come out, so there can be some issues with it. But that's a good question.
We've got one more from the chat. What is the best way to utilize the stranded energy being unutilized currently?
Use it at its source. So you got wind, that's a good example. If there's a way to bring in a intermittent power consumer, which there is some of those out there, economically, that's, if you can do that economically, yes. You're saying you want to get the federal government to subsidize batteries. Sure, I can't answer that one. That's beyond my, but I'm just saying, going back to that question, because that's an excellent question. When we make electricity and we ship it, well, we get it on the grid, right? There's a line loss. Using energy at its source is a major efficiency gain. And that's one of our goals, use it at its source. Another good example is flare gas. Flare gas was really bad early on, and it's dropping drastically. Part of the reason is because we are finding ways to utilize it at its source. So that's another good thing.
Another question from the chat. What would you think of a carbon tax? Then subsidies would not be needed.
That's an opinion question, I guess. I think the most confusing part of the carbon tax would be that drawing the boundary. Like, what is your carbon emission, as far as your usage? That'd be probably one of the biggest difficulties, because you'd have to somehow tally the carbon. Yep.
I know in the scheme of things, it's these kinds of subsidies, it sounds to me really silly to have that discussion, because some of you know I spent almost 10 years of my life in the Middle East and 8 years in Africa. And when I look back at the cost of having our military present to safeguard the flow of fossil fuels from the Middle East to the US until today, I think we probably spent $20 trillion just in military cost alone. If that's not a subsidy, I don't know what is. There is no reason we would have been there if it wasn't for the energy source. Absolutely no reason. When you had the fighting in Sudan, you were perfectly willing to let 500,000 people die. That's not a problem. But when we have a problem with our oil source, then there's no limit to how much subsidy we're going to give in form of military support. And therein lays a big difference. So the pittance that we're asking for here in incentives to subsidies, it dwarfs. I mean, it's nothing compared to what we're spending on safeguarding the source of fossil fuels from other parts of the world. And we are still an importer. We only produce the 10 million barrels a day, and we consume 20 million here. So, yeah, we're still dependent.
I think, I mean, that's over my head, definitely.
Yeah,
but my one question would be, what if we shut off our oil exports that we kind of discussed earlier? What would that do to oil demand? And what would that do to our need for oil from out of the country?
Well, you have to have a planned approach to go forward. I mean, you have to have a target of eliminating the dependency on oil and gas. You're playing into the hands of the enemy. You're actually unpatriotic to continue going down that line when you have alternatives that could give you energy independence at a fixed price from the sun, fixed price from the wind, right? No fluctuations there, no warfare, no international strife, all that kind of stuff that you otherwise have to
I personally I can't get into the international discussions
you
of,
have to,
but
because you're emitting it into the atmosphere, which is the globe.
I always keep going back to the same, just bring it back home. We right now, we have a lot of lights on in this room. We could have hacked as many on.
No, because then I can't see.
No,
Anyway.
no, listen, let's bring it all the way back down.
Yeah, no,
Your house at home could have solar panels, could have a battery, could have everything, right? That's what I'm trying to get at. If it's economical, let's do it.
Yeah, but
But-
you gotta look at this in a global perspective, can't just look at it as one. Anyway.
Yeah.
Well, 2 more questions and then we'll bring it to a close.
Sure.
So I'm gonna
He's
call
been-
on Mr. Colville.
Thank you.
Oh, we've got one more.
Okay, he's
All
been
right,
wanting to
let's
ask
have
one.
3. So let's start over there.
How does all this fit in with the Green New Deal that AOC has come out with? You know about that,
Yeah.
there's no truth.
Yeah, well, I think the innovation over regulation is probably the biggest contrast in those 2 deals, because we're looking at ways to not hinder existing industry and let the market flow and bring in innovative ideas versus make fossil fuels impossible to use. But
Well, if they go through with that, that'll be the coming famine of this world. That Green New Deal.
I'll tell you what, climate change is gonna be a lot worse.
Yes. You're gonna pay much more for that.
Yeah.
You're gonna pay much more for
Maybe
the
not.
adaptation to climate change.
Climate change will be a lot worse than too much regulation. Climate change is gonna kill us.
I suppose you're fully vaccinated too. huh? I can
Same
tell.
here.
okay, who is,
Okay, back up here for the question now.
Yeah, the question I have, kind of keying off of what you said, use at the source. What is your comment of the Bitcoin generating facility north of Jamestown that uses twice the power of the city of Jamestown, and the location was cited because of the Courtney wind farm that's there? And I still don't understand what the hell they're doing out there, but
all right, so
I think it's almost glowing.
crypto mining and data processors is an entirely other topic. And it's pretty far over my head as well as fully understanding all of it.
Substantial amount of energy.
Huge amount of energy. And it's not just here. I mean, it's not more so than data or than crypto mining is just data centers. Like having this ability for all of us to have this data at our fingertips. The amount of energy going into data centers and our grid right now is incredible. That's a very, very, very high user of energy. And getting into the ethics of it, I mean, that's, like I say, that's not something I'm going to comment on, but that is a way to use it as source.
Sure.
Because you need limited broadband for crypto. If it's going to go in anyway, you might as well use it at source where it's more efficient. But the other side of it that's nice with crypto, and this could be utilized as a big benefit to some of the cooperatives and the providers in the area, it's non-essential. So now when you have that pie graph I had up, where the wind takes the big part of it, drops too quickly, you have major loads out there that can be dropped in their consumption level to still level off the demand. So therefore, it's reliable energy for everybody around. So it can be, it's kind of going in both directions because it's a major user, but it could be used for a positive in the way that it's a consumer that can be intermittent, if that makes sense.
And last question up on top.
Sure.
It was actually about his question, but I'd like to continue. So what you're saying is, correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding of what you said was if the demand is too high, it can be reduced because it's not, the data centers are not really essential.
Well,
Their businesses are gonna want power. They don't want reduction.
crypto, it depends on if you're talking a data center. So there's data centers that run 4-hour grid, for what we need for all of our information.
It's completely separate.
A crypto is 100 is separate. So crypto mining can be very, very quickly turned down. So you could take that 50 megawatts and turn it down to 1 megawatt or 5 megawatts through the controls in the data processors there. So these miners that come out are able to sign on with a provider.
It's cheap, they're gonna keep them running.
Okay, so look at, if you go talk to your local provider for electricity, they're going to have a different rate as to whether you want it 100% of the time, or you're willing to be interrupted up to so many percent. and that rate drops drastically. So so that mining company is making a financial decision to say, do I need this 100% of the time, or am I willing to be intermittent?
What if they're using electricity from flare gas?
Then they are in their own control, because that's right there on the site.
So would that be carbon neutral then?
The alternative would be the same as them being there. If the gas was being flared anyway, versus if they utilized it, the same amount of carbon is emitted. From that example, I don't know.
Well, with that, we would like to close our program this evening and give Tom a round of applause. And thank you. Give you some ideas to take back to the governor.